Chapter 8, in which the cavalry officer is reacquainted with two old comrades. You sigh contentedly as you tug your boots off and lie back on your rickety cot. With time of the essence, your day's journey north from Noringia had been a hard one, with considerations of comfort and safety thrown to the winds. The day's ride had been easy on no one, and you look forward to a night's sleep in the dubious shelter of your field tent before setting off again at the same grueling pace in the morning. You freeze as you see the shadow of a man outlined on the firelit canvas wall of your tent. Perhaps it's merely a fellow who has lost his way around the nearly identical tents of the camp. Perhaps it is Elson of Fenton, come to chat or check up on you. Perhaps it is one of your disgruntled men seeking to rid himself of his unpopular officer for good. We're not taking preemptive action. No, might be dangerous. Keep an eye out. As quietly as you can, you load your pistol and feign complacency. You blow out your candle and pull yourself into bed, facing the entrance to your tent, pistol held tightly under your blankets. Sure enough, not a minute later, the flap of your tent opens. When you see the glint of moonlight on the pistol in his hand, it becomes clear to you that your intruder's intentions are far from benign. Your would-be attacker approaches quietly until he looms over your waiting form, and only stops when he feels the cold metal of your pistol pressed against his most valued parts. You smile, your white teeth flashing in the dim moonlight. I would stop moving if I were you. Your attacker freezes as you hold him at gunpoint. Staff Sergeant Fenton and another dragoon quickly respond to your calls to be attended, and soon enough your would-be assailant is safely disarmed and under guard. Your would-be attacker is a man from your troop, one of the known bad apples. Your sergeant works him over for a few minutes. Thankfully, it doesn't take much for him to crack. Your staff sergeant turns to you. Well, young master, this man's grievance with you seems quite obvious to me. Your senior NCO blames the complete lack of discipline. He explains how an officer with poor control of his men often finds himself subject to threats by those who have not been compelled to understand the proper structure of the chain of command. With the question of motive answered, only one issue remains, that of what to do with your attacker. The merciful option would be to simply return him to his tent unharmed. The story would get around, but there would be no lasting effect save for a testament to your compassion or your weakness. Alternatively, you could send the man back to Noringia to stand trial upon your return. That would be the course of action recommended by the King's Articles of War, but it would also be the most wasteful. The penalty for assaulting a superior officer is punishable by death, and your prisoner would no doubt be desperate to escape. He would need to be accompanied by a substantial guard. Lastly, you could always simply have him quickly and quietly killed. The men would talk, of course, but it would be a discreet way of dealing with the problem permanently, issues of morality aside. You wave your staff sergeant over. That's a difficult one. I mean, I don't necessarily want to kill anyone, but I don't think we can afford to escort him back to Noringia, and returning him to his tent. Discipline would probably fall even lower if I just did that. Though, that being said, perhaps it doesn't even matter anyway. I don't know if there's a difference between having a discipline of -13 or -1%. It's still negative. Slit his throat, Jesus Christ. Staff Sergeant, what's your opinion? Fenton seems extremely nervous, even more so now that you have put him on the spot. Well, young master, I'm sure that this fellow has merely fallen in with the wrong sort. Perhaps he was compelled by force or opinion of his more degenerate peers. I'm sure your compassion would prevent him from antagonizing you in the future. Are you sure about that, Fenton? I'm not so sure about that, but... Alright, we'll return him to his tent. For now. Fenton's face is a mask of pride and approval as he leads the prisoner away. Very good, sir. I'll have a talk with him in the morning. It'll never happen again. As you settle back into bed, you work out the consequences of your decision in your head. Your men will certainly think you're more likable, but by not punishing such an utter breach of discipline, your troops' order and respect for their chain of command will likely suffer. Let's have a look at that. -5% discipline plus 10% loyalty. Good. We'll take that. This war has left a mark on us all. Alson muses as he holds his horse at an easy walk next to yours at the head of your men. I would not be surprised if you thought us all entirely different people, my dear fellow. The man has a point. The Davistal Elson you see riding beside you is not the same grandiosely enthusiastic boy which you remember from a training in sea voyage to Antar. Over the past 3 days of riding, you have been able to behold the changes up close. With no other source of refined conversation on the road north, he seems more subdued and quiet, more sure of himself and perhaps possessed of less need to prove it to all around him. The pressure of command and higher rank certainly seem to have changed him for the better. He also seems a better horseman. He sits easily at the head of his men, almost as well as you do, in fact. You have not seen him fumble in the saddle once on the long ride north. Elson reins his horse to a stop just short of a post nailed into the forest floor at the side of the road. You hear the sound of several flintlocks being cocked coming from the underbrush ahead. You hear a voice from ahead. At 2 o'clock the drums will sound. Elson gives an immediate reply. And lure the dragon from sky to ground. For a moment there is naught but the sound of 80 men and horses shuffling nervously on the road. Then, that's the passphrase. Carry on, sir. Elson apologizes to you as you and your men pass by the still alert sentries hidden in the woods. Sorry about that, dear fellow. We're too far north to be sure who might come calling. I sent a troop ahead to secure the rendezvous point, picked the best men I had for the job. Who is your best man? Elson smiles cryptically at your question, a glint of boyish mischief in his eye. Oh, you know each other quite well enough, dear fellow. I suppose we'll all be more civilized about it than when we were back at Fernanda's court, of course. You and Elson emerge from the forest into a great clearing, covered in tents and that miasma of shit, smoke, and general filth which serves as the universal sign of any force of fighting men on the march. In the center stands a ruined stone hall. Its stone walls are charred black and its windows long shattered to pieces. Perhaps it had been abandoned at the beginning of the war, or perhaps it had been burned and ruined in one of the many feudal conflicts between rival lords of the Congress, which Antar holds a host to on occasion. Then again, perhaps the whole ruin had been caused by the very men who now camp around it, hungry for plunder and the sheer pleasure derived from the act of destruction. Elson dismounts and motions for you and the men following you to do the same. You lead your horses to a crude, impromptu enclosure before quickly setting up an area fit for 80 men to camp in. Elson is quick, decisive, and gets the job done quickly. It appears he was right. He does seem an entirely different person. This being done, the captain leads you to the ruined stone edifice at the center of the camp. The sentries recognize their new squadron commander on sight and allow the two of you entrance with a quick snap to attention. The interior of the building has obviously been converted into some sort of headquarters. A pair of cornets scurry about, checking reports and marking locations on a set of maps set neatly on a large stone table. However, of the officer Elson had placed in command, there is no sign. You make another step forward, only to nearly trip on a chunk of fallen masonry. The head of what had once been the statue of a beautiful woman with long flowing hair and matronly features. You recognize it as the Mother of Ascension, the central figure of the entire faith, which, aside from the existence of that one central figure, is so nearly identical to your own. With a start, you realize that every single piece of statuary in the hall has been given similar treatment. The walls are lined with beheaded figures, desecrated by fresh cuts from hatchets and sabers. Elson seems just as shocked as you are. Who is responsible for the defacement of these figures? He asks, his tone commanding. The nearest subaltern runs up, saluting. The troop commander, sir. The captain's face twists into a mask of puzzlement. Why would he do that, dear fellow? The response comes not from the junior officer, but from a calm tenor from behind you. Simply because it is the duty of the faithful to destroy the marks of heresy wherever they may be found. You turn to confront the voice only to find yourself face to face with Kaios Dal Kazarosta. Kazarosta wears the 2 pips of a lieutenant now, just like you. He gives a stiff salute to Captain Elson and holds it until it is returned before facing you. Lieutenant Castleton, a pleasure to make your acquaintance once again. Kazarosta grips your hand firmly enough as he shakes it, but his expression is absolutely impenetrable. If anything, he has become even more frigid and unemotional since your days together at Fernanda's court. Elson takes another sidelong glance at the defaced statues lining the hall before shaking his head and waving his hand in a dismissive gesture. Lieutenant Kazarosta, we shall discuss the necessity of your actions during my absence later. Now to business. Kazarosta leads you to the set of maps placed on the stone table, an altar, you think, and waves the subalterns away. As you approach, you can see a meticulously drawn map of the surrounding forest, with the position of your camp and currently active patrols marked by wooden tokens painted dark orange. I've been dispatching scouting parties ever since we got here, and we now have a passable knowledge of the terrain around us. The other lieutenant points out 4 or 5 tokens outside of the main cluster representing the camp. Wait, that's the other lieutenant? Who's the one actually speaking? That is something I don't like in some of these. Like, if a story is written in such a way that you can't tell who's speaking, there's something wrong with it. And at least in this part, I can't tell who's speaking. The other lieutenant points out 4 or 5 tokens outside of the main cluster representing the camp. These markers represent those patrol projected positions. We update them every 6 hours or so. Yeah, you'll just get generic voice. Elson nods his head, half eager and half impatient. Indeed, Lieutenant. And any news of your quarry? Okay, so it was supposed to be Kazarosta. Kazarosta smiles, a pale, malicious thing which seems sedate and vicious all at the same time. We've good news there, sir. The Antari we clashed with about a week ago have been trying to flee back into the plains ever since we disengaged with them. I had a patrol follow them. It seems that we had put enough fear into them to get them running on the open road, as fast as their legs could carry them. The captain scowls, his brows angle in frustration. Saints be damned. If they were on the Imperial Highway and making that sort of haste, they'll be halfway to Oktoberrit by now. The deaf-born lieutenant shakes his head. That is, of course, assuming that they've kept a steady pace. I can assure you they have not. Wait, so that was Kazarosta, and Jesus Christ. Kazarosta points at a cluster of tokens painted white gathered around a river crossing not 100 kilometers north of the camp, and accompanied by copious notes in Kazarosta's neat mechanical handwriting. I've had Staff Sergeant Lanzarella and his men follow them for the past few days. The reports give a most certain image. The Antari are camped here, at the river, in a fortified camp. Elson looks at the map for a moment and nods. Perhaps they decided to rest their men and mounts after they realized that we were not in any state to pursue them, he muses. The captain's eyes dart around the map, a grin forming on his lips. Kazarosta notices it too. I suppose you have a plan, sir? The aristocratic officer nods at Kazarosta's essayed query, a full smile on his lips. Indeed, Lieutenant. Call the staff meeting. Captain Elson's staff consists of the 2 cornets already present, yourself, Kazarosta, and the senior sergeants of each troop, as well as 2 other subalterns. The meeting comes together quickly, and the entire assembly is brought up to date by Kazarosta's intelligence in less than 10 minutes. The other officers and NCOs shuffle nervously as the full immensity of the tactical problem before them is revealed. The previous engagement had been a blind skirmish in the woods. With the full strength of the enemy force revealed, the prospect of facing that same enemy seems more daunting than before. With the others now informed, Elson takes command of the meeting. Gentlemen, you are now all aware of the problem. Let us turn our minds to solutions. I propose the following course of action. Elson speaks with an air of command that you have never heard before as he outlines his battle plan. The Antari are retreating, but they will likely also be overconfident in their numbers and in their fortified positions. On the other hand, we have only enough feed and rations for 4 days and water for a week. If we are to strike, we must do so now, unless you gentlemen have no objections to walking back south. The captain gathers up the orange tokens and arrays them in front of the Antari camp. With thumb and forefinger, he pushes roughly half of them forward into the midst of the red tokens representing the Antari. We shall advance half of our force forward and challenge the enemy to open battle. I doubt that whoever is in command of that force would pass up an opportunity to destroy a numerically inferior force in the open. When he sorties with his men, the second part of our force will burn the Antari camp, whilst the distraction element focuses the attentions of our aggressive suitors upon themselves. You find yourself nodding along with much of the rest of the assembled men. It is a risky plan, but if the captain is set on its execution, then there is very little you can do to oppose him. He is, after all, your commanding officer. With the entire camp destroyed, the enemy will be thrown into disarray. Without supplies, shelter, or ammunition stores, they shall have no choice but to return north. Alson looks around the table. Well then, gentlemen, any questions or comments? For the barest sliver of a moment, there is naught but silence. The other men around the table seem well acquainted enough with Alson's style of battle, and they all seem to approve to some extent or another. All except one. Kazarosta raises his hand, his expression unchanged. With all due respect, sir, I have certain reservations about your plan of action. I believe it to rely too much on the cooperation of our enemies. More to the point, sir, the destruction of the enemy force does not appear to have been among the final objectives of your plan. Is that not so? Kazarosta continues, the sheer force of his voice carrying... Carrying? That's not how you spell carrying, if that's what it's supposed to be. Carrying him past any potential accusations of excessive presumption that might have served to stop him. Therefore, I must conclude that the victory which your plan will provide, though inspired, is incomplete. The insinuating tone of Kazarosta's words catch you by surprise. Clearly the man has cut away some of his bluntness since you last saw him. Elson turns in reply, and you brace yourself, expecting the hot response of the proud aristocrat, insulted by a lowly deaf-born bastard. Instead, he merely dips his head, his eyebrows betraying only the slightest hint of annoyance. I suppose you have an alternative then, Lieutenant Kazarosta? The deaf-born officer looks to the two men standing in front of him. Without a word, they step aside with all the resistance of a cloud of smoke. Kazarosta steps up to the edge of the table and into the recently vacated space, his face fixed in a predatory grin. Indeed, I do, sir. To your complete surprise, Elson responds not with indignity, but merely with a calm expression, trying very hard to hide a set of gritted teeth. It seems that despite their enmity, Elson has learned to at least give Kazarosta's often rude demeanor some minimal amount of tolerance. Very well, Lieutenant. I set you at liberty to enlighten the rest of us. Kazarosta examines the map for a moment, his expression tight. Then his hands reach out and begin moving the orange counters to their original position as he explains his proposed plan of action. I believe the captain's plan to be fundamentally sound. However, I must respectfully point out that he has overlooked two factors which I believe to be fundamental. First, the Antari are unprepared. They are retreating towards their own lines already, and their failure to post pickets implies either a supreme arrogance or an absolute wariness, which would leave them easily panicked. You can't help but notice that Kazarosta has grown more verbose over the years. Perhaps it's Elson's influence. Secondly, we must not ignore the fact that a substantial Antari force has penetrated deep into territory held by the king's army. Despite their current complacency, I would, based on their performance in their previous engagements against us, rate them as accomplished amateurs, if not merely careless veterans. In either sense, it behooves us to deprive the enemy of a body of fighting men of such quality. Kazarosta locks eyes with Elson as if he and the captain were the only two standing around the map. Thus, I present the following plan with the objective of destroying the entire force as utterly as possible. The others seem unruffled as Kazarosta begins moving the counters. Clearly this is not uncommon. You pick out an almost uniform air of unease and annoyance from the other officers, but none move to stop him. For a deaf-born bastard to have won the grudging tolerance, if not the respect, of so many Banebloods is extraordinary in itself. How do you think he's managed it? He's likely manipulating them. Indeed, it does seem like something Kazarosta would do, as cold a fellow as you know him to be. Kazarosta splits the orange counters into two groups. One he begins placing in the forest south of the Antari camp. My plan will also require splitting our forces in two. The main force will take positions in the forest and ambush along the road. The lieutenant's expression seems to take on some warmth as he takes the other handful of counters, the smaller one, and sweeps them eastward along the river to a place marked in ink. Our scouts have identified a ford further up the river. The Antari have failed to guard or post lookouts there. We must then assume that they do not know of its existence. Thus, I would have the smaller portion of our forces cross the second fort under the cover of the night, and circle around to the rear of the entire encampment and thus catch them unawares. His voice grows louder as he moves the smaller group across the river and around to the entire encampment. Using darkness and surprise, the second force will drive the entire in disarray further southward, towards the majority of our force. He pushes the entire back towards the first group, his voice now burning with crusading zeal. I have no doubt that the great majority of the enemy would scatter or surrender in the face of such a hopeless situation, allowing our forces to hunt down the remainder at our leisure. With a sweep of his hand, he brushes the scattered rat tokens aside. You find yourself holding your own breath. The entire table is enraptured as if Kazarosta were a virtuoso violinist. It takes the quiet sound of Captain Elson clearing his own throat to bring your attention back to the meeting as a whole. I would rate it a good plan, Kazarosta. Certainly one worth considering, he announces with almost no sincerity whatsoever. He turns to the other gathered officers who seem to be strongly resisting the urge to break out into debate over the merits of opposing plans. Gentlemen, your thoughts? The meeting disintegrates into half a dozen voices all arguing for one plan or the other. Which do you favor? I think I've said this before, but I can't really follow something I'm reading very well while I'm reading it out loud. So basically, I've got like half a decent idea of what Kazarosta's plan is. I've completely forgotten Elson's plan at this point. So sure, Kazarosta, you'll win me over this time. You decide that Lieutenant Kazarosta has the better plan, mostly because yeah, I feel in my guts, yeah. No, most of the squadron would have a way out should the worst happen. Your voice joins the cacophony as you make your opinion known. The debate rages for nearly an hour, the light of the setting sun casting red highlights on the animated faces of the gathered officers. Only you, Elson, and Kazarosta remain silent as partisans begin to take sides. Soon it becomes clear to all that any agreement is far beyond any conceivable horizon. Elson clears his throat loudly. The darkening interior of the desecrated shrine falls silent. My dear fellows, I'm afraid we shall be here all night. If we are to continue this discussion, if we are to continue to discuss this matter thus, perhaps it would be best if we were to adjourn for a while, to see our men fed and our watches set for the evening, before we come back to this matter. The captain's insignia on his tunic gives Elson's courtly suggestion the weight of a command. The assembled junior officers quickly agree to an extended recess. It is only then that you realize just how hungry you are, having not eaten since the beginning of the day's ride. With as much dignity as you can muster, you hurry yourself out of the meeting to order supper. Supper turns out to be salt pork, hardtack, and a thin potato soup. Hard fare for someone used to years of soft garrison duty in Orangia. However, hunger makes even this meager meal seem worth eating, and quickly. As you retrieve your filled mess tins from the squadron steward, you take in the sight of dozens of campfires lighting up the shadowy hollow of the clearing. While the enlisted men seem to be huddled around cook fires not far from the pitched tents, the other officers appear to have congregated in a makeshift officers' mess, in the shadow of the ruined temple. From here you can see Kazarosta and Elson sitting on opposite ends of the temple courtyard, each eating in silence. It is then you decide to... We haven't seen Kazarosta in a while, sure. You find Kazarosta not eating with the rest of the officers, but among a knot of enlisted men, dragoons of his troop. Perched atop the boundary wall of the ruined monastery, he speaks with his men in hushed, serious tones. Despite his supposed preoccupation, he spots you as soon as you step into the light of the fires. The other lieutenant turns to greet you, his face as composed as ever. Lieutenant Castleton, a surprise, he says, his voice hard and unwelcoming. Sit and we may talk. The next few minutes are spent mostly listening. Despite his invitation to join him, Kazarosta seems to have no interest in terminating his previous conversation. It is an eminently practical thing, mostly regarding the various tricks of campaigning. From what you can tell, the listeners are mostly new men and as such liable to benefit from such assistance. Finally, Kazarosta dismisses his men and turns to you. Now, You want something from me, is that not so? How do you respond? Yeah, sure. We'll ask him about Elson's plan. Casarosta seems to know what you're about to say before you even say it. You wanted to ask about Captain Elson's plan. Did you do it because you honestly wanted a second opinion? Did you want to know to find a better way, or to find a way to change my mind? Or did you ask expecting me to name it folly and vanity to settle your own opinion before committing yourself against it? No matter, because that's all it is. Folly and vanity. Casarosta points to the side, waiting until your eyes follow his hand and catches sight of your squadron commander, eating alone on the other side of the courtyard. A melancholic expression spread upon his violet face. The last few years have not been easy on him, Castleton. He ran into this war with his naive notions of gallantry and romance wrapped around him like a cloak. The first year left that in tatters. Now he clings to the shreds as if they were all he had left. There's nothing left for him now but a glorious death, and he cares not if we die with him. Do not try to convince me otherwise, no profit will come of it. The next few minutes pass in silence, as the two of you finish your meals and take your leave. There is nothing left to be said. Unfortunately, the break in the discussion does not seem to have changed anybody's mind. Neither Elson nor Casarosta have seen fit to concede the point to the other. The debate renews as the more junior officers of the squadron squabble over the fine merits and deficiencies of one plan or the other. Both the captain and the other lieutenant remain silent, staring at each other with sullen eyes lit hot yellow by the reflected light of the flickering lamps. Then they both turn to you once again. With the night well in progress, it is clear that they expect you to act as a definite arbiter between the two of them. Alright, we've gone with it so far, sure, let's stick with it. You try to word it as tactfully as you can. Elson is obviously far from euphoric that you have thrown in against him. Thankfully, the other more junior officers follow your lead. The captain has been backed into a corner. Your commanding officer could, of course, simply order his subordinates to carry out an unpopular course of action, but Grenadier Square tends to look rather poorly upon officers who ignore the opinions of their subordinates entirely, a fact which Elson has clearly become familiar with over the past years. Your squadron commander gives up his lost cause, but not before sending a sad, slow shake of his head your way. With the meeting concluded, there is little left to do but to return to your men. It is the work of a mere half hour to review the sentry posts assigned to your section of the camp. This done, you inform the men of the plan. The men seem to accept it well enough, but your staff sergeant looks ill at ease. He approaches you afterwards, his voice low and taut. Young master, I've been told that the deaf-born bastard Casarosta is the one who cooked up this wild plan for tomorrow's action. I do not think such a creature would be able to comprehend the higher thought required of gentlemen officers. I have no doubt that no good can come of following this course of action to the finish. Please be careful. No. Staff Sergeant, I know Lieutenant Casarosta well enough to assure you that he has a sharp tactical mind. I have little doubt that this stratagem of his will succeed. If you insist, sir. I do. Now, if you have nothing further, you are dismissed. Your sergeant having been dealt with, you retreat into your bedroll. Exhausted, you quickly fall asleep. The next day, you awake to the brassy tones of reveille, a half an hour before sunrise. It takes some doing to get your men to wake up and fall into marching order. By the time you report in with your squadron, the sun is already firmly above the horizon. Elson and Casarosta are already waiting with their troops. The captain's impatient expression does not fill you with much pride. With the squadron assembled, the captain gives the signal to begin the long ride into battle.